So this is Richard Brown. I am an associate professor of business strategy at Penn State Harrisburg, and I'm doing a quick video for students for multiple classes, but on the baby formula shortage that is going on right now in the United States. And when I say right now, I'm recording this May 21st, 2022. And so if you are to watch this video at some point in the future, there may not be a shortage any longer, but as of today, there is a shortage. And what I find interesting about this shortage, of course, it's tragic, but what I find interesting from an academic standpoint is it meshes many of the ideas in a business strategy course. And so some of those ideas are here on the screen. We have industry structure, which is, how are markets structured? How do firms behave dependent upon that structure? So oligopolistic markets, we would anticipate that firms that are in oligopolies will, exude power and use that power to their advantage, at least to some degree. But this is also an interesting topic because there's monopsony power involved in the United States market for baby formula. And monopsony is not a term that many people deal with. We usually think about monopoly. Monopsony is where you have one or very few buyers. So normally think about monopoly as sellers. Polloi in Greek is seller. So monopolloi would be one seller. Monopsony is where you have a market structure, a vertical structure where there's only one buyer. Or in this case, it doesn't have to be one buyer, but you might have one dominant buyer. And in this case that we're going to see here, monopsony power is going to be with the government, which is even more potentially problematic from a structure standpoint. So industry structure has a lot to do with the baby formula issues, since there are only a handful of firms, not even a handful of firms, that control 100% of the baby formula market. But there are other things that in a strategy class we touch on, and that would be government regulation and government constraints. Obviously, corporations have to deal with government rules. And in this case, we have FDA rules that are very, very strict. And I'm sure that there are good reason for that. Obviously, we want to have safe baby formula in the United States, but these FDA rules are even stricter than many other products that we have on the market. So FDA rules that are very, very constraining, as well as import issues. We cannot generally import baby formula from other countries because of some ingredient differences and things like this. So there are government regulation and constraint issues that couple with these industry structure issues. And then on top of these two topics, we also have exogenous shocks and endogenous failures. Of course, the major exogenous shock that we've seen in the last couple of years is the COVID, the lockdowns, et cetera. But what we're seeing now in 2022 are all of these supply chain disruptions. And I put here supply and distribution issues. So these disruptions in the vertical chain are becoming problematic, coupled with the government regulation, coupled with the industry structure. And then we also have endogenous failures in that we had tainted formula at Abbott Laboratories, which is the largest producer of baby formula in the United States. And this tainted formula shut down production of Abbott's baby formula products for quite a while. And that goes back to the FDA rules, because the FDA had to give them a permit to restart that plant. So these are the topics that I think are interesting for the baby formula shortage. We're going through, of course, lots and lots of shortages in the US in mid 2022, and inflation and all of these topics. But this is something a little bit maybe more important, since baby formula, of course, is going to be important for babies. So this is an article from today's Wall Street Journal, again, today being May 21st, 2022. And I'm just highlighting some things yellow so that I can make some points that mesh with the three topics from the last, from that picture. And of course, the article is about the flawed system, and this video is about the flawed system. This is one of the most regulated food products in the country, and that means that the barriers to entry become extremely high. For those of you in strategy courses, you often will talk about barriers to entry, maybe as part of the Porter's 5 Forces model, and the barriers will condition the market. And so in this case, we have high barriers to entry, and therefore very low entry, very low probability of new products coming on the market, especially new products that will become real horizontal competitors with the incumbent firms. Who are the incumbent firms? Similac and Enfamil are the products that we're used to. Similac is made by Abbott Labs, and Enfamil is made by Reckitt Benckiser. And so these are going to be the two largest producers of baby formula in the United States. And of course, here it says that they have 80% of the infant and toddler formula sales in the United States. This goes to the oligopolistic market conditions and the industry structure issues that we have. Limited choice, limited manufacturers of baby formula, coupled with these other issues. The last figures I could find had Abbott at about 45% market share and Reckitt at about 35% market share. There are going to be two other manufacturers of baby formula that will be somewhat that we would need to know, and that's going to be about 10% for Perrigo and about 10% for Nestle. And when we think about horizontal competition, the way we can think about it is through a Herfendoll measure. Okay, and our Herfendoll Hirschman Index is the summation, okay, of the squared market shares of each firm. That's the subscript I, okay, from I equals 1 to N, where N is any firm above 1%. In a market like this, then you're really only talking about 4 figures that you need. And the easier way to put this is you square the market shares, okay, and then sum. So if we think about Abbott at 45%, Beckett at 35%, and then I'm going to estimate Perrigo at 10 and Nestle at 10. The way we work in the Herfendoll is we square these numbers. And let's see. So 45 squared, 2025. 35 squared is 1225. And then 100 and 100. And then we sum these squared numbers and we have 3250, 3450. Okay. So the Herfendoll in the product market that we're talking about here, which is baby formula in the geography, United States, would be 3450. What does this mean? Well, the Herfendoll goes from 0 to 10,000. 10,000 would be an actual monopoly because that would be 100 squared. And obviously 5,000 is in the middle, but really this over here about 1,500 is what we consider concentrated. And when we say we, when I say we, I'm talking about academics who study this, such as myself, but really the Department of Justice. Okay, so the Department of Justice will start getting involved at 1,500. And so from 0 to 1,500, very little regulation in terms of market consolidation, oligopolistic competition. Over 1,500, you're going to start to see this increase. And the more it is over 1,500, the more scrutiny companies will get. And when we say scrutiny, what we're thinking about are coordination efforts, okay, which we could think of as collusion or cartelization, being a cartel, and merger and acquisition. So over 1,500, you start to see the Department of Justice and to some degree the Federal Trade Commission get involved in looking at horizontal coordination. Horizontal coordination would be things like if Abbott and Beckett tried to set prices a certain way, so price fixing. Merger and acquisition would be if any of these two companies tried to merge with each other. If one tried to acquire one of the other ones, the Department of Justice would most likely file a lawsuit against that. And so we're clearly well over the 1,500. You can see it with, you can eyeball it. There's only 4 firms. They own the entire market. And of course, this becomes problematic from a number of standpoints, one being pricing and the other being the fact that when you have government constraint and exogenous shocks and endogenous failures like we have had in this industry over the last year or so, you just have limited choice. Again, if Abbott and Beckett are 80% of the market, this is quite concentrated, and so this is very problematic in terms of the market in general. And of course, industry structure and industrial organization is a large part of the business strategy course, and so that's something for us at least to understand. So we have our industry structure, oligopoly. I'll get to monopsony power in a little bit. Government regulation and constraint, our FDA rules and imports not allowed, and then exogenous shocks and endogenous failures. So let's think about this from a vertical standpoint. Okay, so we'll remember these numbers, and so your Herfendoll measure will be a horizontal issue, and then from a vertical issue, of course, lots of companies are dealing with vertical issues. We'll have our supply chain here, and then we'll say distribution here. I sometimes call it demand chain, but distribution here. At the bottom, okay, all the way downstream, we think about having a consumer, and at the top, all the way upstream, we think about raw goods. Okay, and then we can just think about our horizontal market somewhere around here. And we'll call our horizontal market, we'll call it baby formula. And then, of course, we have our 4 firms. And I'll try to make them somewhat, I'll make the X's of the 4 firms to denote that they're not each 25%, that there's some kind of variation between them in terms of size. But there's only 4, and that becomes problematic. So normally we think about, when we look at horizontal analysis, we think about this as being a problem, right? But there are more problems in this market before you get to down here. This could be a baby, or of course could be the family. And one of the problems in this article that we see, and I'll go back to here, is over here, the federal government is the product's biggest buyer. So about 50% of baby formula is acquired by the federal government, which then delegates this formula to the states. Okay, so that becomes problematic, and that's what we're going to call monopsony power. Okay, so as we see here, we see our baby formula. I'll get to the supply chain issues in a minute, but I think the demand chain or distribution issues are even more problematic. And so if we think about how does baby formula get from the manufacturer to the baby, okay, well, one thing we have to do is we have to think about logistics. And in this case, we'll say trucking. For the most part, you're going to truck baby formula. Remember, shipping is not going to be a big deal because we don't allow international baby formula. So if we did, then the shipping issue that we have would be an issue, but that's not an issue. So it's mostly going to be trucking. You could have some railroad issues, but we'll say trucking. And what do we know about trucking? We know that there is a decreased capacity, increased pricing, and also baby formula is very heavy. And so as the article, we'll see something in the article that for these companies to get their products onto trucking and get a good price for trucking rates, transportation rates, it becomes problematic because there are many other things that the trucking companies can move that aren't so heavy. So the heavy nature of baby formula is a problem. And then you go from trucking to, well, where does it get trucked to? Well, there are 2 different places here. You can think about retailers, your Walmarts and Targets, etc., which then will sell to you. But over here, you have an even bigger issue in this case, and that's the government, the federal government, and a 50% share of formula purchased. Okay, so this becomes what we call monopsony power. And monopsony, again, is when you have one buyer. So, and again, I realize it's not one buyer, but you have a very large buyer. That's why I'm calling it monopsony power, not a monopsony. Okay, so the federal government being that buyer can become problematic. Let me just box these off so that we know that we're labeling these. Okay. And so you have all of these, you have this issue in terms of your inflation, transportation, trucking issue. And then of course, half of the supply is going to the federal government. Now, it gets actually worse than that in terms of the government issue. And that's because as opposed to the federal government purchasing 50% of the formula and then getting it to people who would otherwise buy it at the retail location, our federalist nature of our government, where we have a federal government and states, means that we add a layer of regulatory complexity. Okay. And so here we're saying that WIC, which is a federal program, is purchasing 50% of the formula, but then states award exclusive sales contracts to a single formula manufacturer in exchange for discounts. And so it's actually even more concentrated than that. And this map here will show you that which states use which of the manufacturer. Abbott, of course, being the largest manufacturer, has the most states. In those states, you're going to have something close to a monopolist, right? So for example, I'm in Pennsylvania. In Pennsylvania, you're going to have Abbott having that contract with the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and Abbott has more of a monopoly than it would, kind of nationally. I said it has 45% market share. In Pennsylvania, it may have 70 or 80% market share. And likewise, Reckitt may have it in other states. And so the fact that states in and of themselves induce more monopolistic competition over oligopolistic competition sets that power dynamic even worse off for families with babies in each state. It's just that in each state, there's a different monopolist. Okay. And again, not a true monopolist, but a company with monopoly power. Okay. In addition to the states doing this, hospitals have now moved to this federal program, where the hospitals are now also choosing one manufacturer, and those hospitals are getting discounts for choosing one manufacturer. And so in addition to states themselves, hospital systems are also consolidating the market at a micro level more than it would be consolidated at the national level. Okay. Talk about exogenous shocks and endogenous failures. Exogenous is outside of the firm or industry. Endogenous is within. So you have your supply and distribution issues, which we all know. We're all dealing with these issues right now in other facets, not just baby formula, but you have increased and immense supply chain and distribution inflation. And let me show you a little bit about the supply chain issues. The supply chain issues are maybe not as bad as the distribution issues in this market, but what goes in the baby formula? So the supply chain would be things like milk, minerals, vitamins, and vegetable oils. Now, for those of you who follow any business news, especially the Wall Street Journal, this has become hugely problematic. And one of the exogenous shocks, besides COVID, that is affecting the supply of all different types of oils is the war in Ukraine, where a great proportion of oils will come from. So for example, sunflower oil, 50% of sunflower oil comes from Russia and Ukraine. It is not being exported to most degrees right now. And so that becomes another exogenous issue. So this is an exogenous shock from COVID, from the supply shocks that we're having in general, and then the ones specific to Russia and Ukraine. Minerals and vitamins are also having supply chain issues, and to some degree milk, although milk is much more localized, so a little bit less. So your supply chain issues are bad, but they're not nearly as bad as the distribution issues in this industry. Okay. Couple closing thoughts that when you have a concentrated market, and the reason that we in business strategy classes that we teach about oligopolistic competition is, that you can create these problems when you have very few choices, either in the market for supplies or the market for outputs. And then when you couple them with other things that are going on in society, that become even bigger problems. So trucking shortages, you have your state and hospital issues. And then of course your endogenous issue that you have in this industry is right here. And that is in February, Abbott Labs halted production at its biggest factory. Again, 45% of the nation's production, responsible for 1/5 of its formula. So you're talking about 10% of the nation's formula in total was shut down, and there was a voluntary recall, and regulators had to come in. They have started to ramp up that production, but that's slowly getting back online, and that becomes problematic. So again, to recap, industry structure, government regulation, exogenous shocks. When these things come into confluence with each other, you can have an increased problem in the supply chain and distribution chain of any product. Of course, products that are essential to humans are even more of an issue. Thank you.